If you are watching this video, chances are very good that you are into yoga, or you have at least taken a few yoga classes. But did you know that yoga as it is practiced today has some dubious roots that are connected with racism and eugenics? Now, to be clear, certain yogic practices go back thousands of years, but the kind of yoga that is practiced today, modern yoga, which is essentially a form of exercise, really has roots in about the late 1800s, so about 140 years ago. I also want to say that I'm not a yoga scholar, but here's what I've learned through my research about how yoga transformed from an esoteric spiritual practice into basically a form of gymnastics. So, late 1800s, the British were still occupying India. There was a racist stereotype floating around that Indians were degenerate and lazy. So the Indians themselves began developing these exercise routines partly based on yoga in order to counteract this stereotype and portray themselves as very vigorous and fit. At the same time, former British soldiers were enlisted to lead exercise drills in colonial schools. And most of these exercise drills drew upon this kind of yogic influence, but they were essentially calisthenics. In 1894, a guy named Swami Vivekananda introduced yoga to Western audiences at the World's Parliament of Religions, which was held in Chicago. But the person who had the most profound influence on modern yoga was a guy named Eugen Sandow. He was a German bodybuilder and a former circus performer and strongman who visited India in 1905, and he was already famous, but he established himself as essentially a cultural hero. Now, it should be noted that Sandow's original name was Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, but he changed his name to Eugen because it was short for eugenics. So yoga from the very beginning has these strong nationalistic underpinnings, and some people took this to the extreme. For example, I write about in my book characters named Francis Yates Brown and J.F.C. Fuller. They were British officers who, while they were serving in occupied India, they read about yoga and became very interested in it, and then later they became fascists and supporters of this guy. And these guys were far from alone. In the early 20th century, there were a bunch of figures who combined yoga and fascism, and very famously, the SS did yogic exercises under the direction of Himmler, who was into yogic philosophy and allegedly carried a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, none of this is to imply that yoga is inherently fascist. It's just to point out that there are some strong connections there, and also to introduce the subject of what has been called body fascism. And this shows up externally as shaming and judging people whose bodies do not conform to cultural standards. Turned inwardly, body fascism can show up as self-judgment, self-loathing, fixation on what one eats and diet, use of steroids, plastic surgery, fixation on how one looks, and of course eating disorders like orthorexia, which is a fixation on purity.